That's what I'm talking about with the alternative field trip assignment. So if you go to some place that is managed for forest and outdoor recreation, and you have a good old time, hiking, take your dog for a walk, rock climbing, kayaking, whatever your jam is, or if you've recently done that, take a bunch of pictures and give me like a one-sentence caption of like a dozen of those pictures. What am I looking at in terms of forest and outdoor recreation management that you found on site? And so all the stuff that we're talking about all semester long is at all of these places in whatever local form it takes. So it's just an exercise to train your eyes to see stuff that's legit forestry, park management stuff going on in the wild. And turn that in by email or text it to me or whatever, just by the end of the semester. About enough time to get through vegetation as a resource, and then I'll set us up for after Thanksgiving to wrap this stuff up. Cool. So when you have soil resources plus water resources, typically we're looking at vegetation resources in most places as well. So let's get into our forest resources and non-forest vegetation resources as a resource specifically with respect to forest and outdoor recreation management. So there's a lot of energy conversion that vegetation is doing constantly, right? So we manufacture solar cells and it's a lot of work to get a little bit of efficiency out of it, and yet most of the planet, at least the dry surface of the planet, is covered in free solar energy conversion and nutrient conversion anyway, right? So we pay a lot of attention to vegetation resources, obviously in forest recreation management. In a lot of national parks like Sequoia and Kings Canyon, the vegetation is specifically the reason for it. Okay? So that's a pretty big deal. And in the same way that we think of certain wildlife species as charismatic, we want to think of certain vegetation species the same way, and how we have certain wildlife species that are less charismatic. We have a lot of plant species that are going to be like that as well, right? So anything that is weird, novel, exotic, strange, that's going to be high on the list. Anything that is really, really huge, really, really old, really, really delicate, also going to be on the list. Okay? So there's some pretty interesting diversity in these plant organisms, and we're going to basically collapse these down from the species level down into the life form or growth form level, right? So we're going to kind of collapse all trees together as trees, mature trees, saplings, or seedlings, according to their size class. And we're going to look at forest forbs as a class instead of looking at Venus flytraps or Jack in the Pulpit, sundew plants, whatever. And again, we're not, in recreation management, we're not just saddled with managing a functional and healthy and integral vegetative ecosystem component. We are also absolutely dealing with all of those ecosystem components filtered through the lenses, plural, that visitors are bringing and experiencing those plant resources through, okay? So plants that only bloom one night a year, plants that only bloom at night, prickly pear only blooms during the day and opens and closes each day during its flowering season, and people key in on that stuff and they plan their trip around these things when they tend to know them. Also, we want to think about trees and other vegetation, how they really kind of drive what a landscape view looks like, right? So if landscapes are an entire class of resource, topography plus vegetation is going to pretty much force how that landscape or that vista, that photo point looks. And also strongly govern the soundscape. Hugely strong effects on soundscape as a resource through plants. In desert environments, which we don't think of as being sort of intensive for vegetation, every once in a while, maybe once or twice a decade, we'll get what's called a desert superbloom, where there is like a super cycle of monsoonal rains and constructively interfering, so lots of extra rain that year. And so the following growth season, we'll have just entire landscapes out west in the arid southwest, just purple and bright yellow and green and bright red, depending on the particular flowering species there. And we have to manage that specifically for recreation purposes, because when these desert superblooms happen, now that Instagram is a thing, we have entire areas, especially roadside access areas, of these wild superblooms getting destroyed, legitimately extirpated, trampled to death, loved to death by influencers who are just trying to chase some clout. Unfortunate, but that is the world absolutely in which we live in. Now, also, this is not a national park. This is a Miyazaki film. I did this for you. Okay? So let's all have a moment of zen with that. Anyway, we're also looking at individually large organisms or colonies like the Aspen clonal colonies or General Sherman or Hyperion, right? Some of the largest organisms on the planet are here in our United States national parks. And if you have never been to a place like Muir Woods or walked among giant sequoia or coastal redwoods as a forestry person, do it. Spend the money, carve out the time, do it. John Muir, for whom Muir Woods is named, wasn't wrong when he said that walking among a grove of trees like this is a genuinely spiritual experience, okay? I can't hype it up enough. It will break your brain to stand next to a tree that is 30 feet in diameter. Okay. Cool. So, also vibrant and functional vegetation resources, they're going to provide a lot of the ecosystem services that we need to pay a lot of attention to in terms of that integral structure and function that we are trying to protect and preserve. One of those ecosystem services is going to be to ablate or absorb and defray or diffuse sideways the kinetic energy impact of billions, trillions of raindrops. Right? So we've talked about how rain is such a damaging thing to soil resources, unmanaged, and so forth, right? Your forest and your forest forbs, like forest floor, even grassoids, all of this stuff is locking soil into place. and helping to absorb what is normal and climate amplified in terms of precipitation inputs, right? So pretty tricky stuff. In terms of the growth form, meaning the shape in which, the conformation in which the plant grows. So if it's like a basal rosette where it's a bunch of leaves all sprouting out radially from a single central point, basal rosette, like Plantago species, for example, as a forest floor cover. When you step on those with a foot, when you roll over them with a bike tire or OHV tire or something like that, if the plant can prostrate itself, if it can lay flat like a grass and like a tree cannot, then it's going to be much, much more resistant to impact and resilient to it typically. So think about something like a turf or sod covered soccer field, right? We can play intensive sports on that, and as long as it's not overwhelmingly intensive, like that grass is still going to be growing even after we've run up and down with it with spiked cleats and so forth. Okay, so we can use that growth form or prostration ability of certain wildlife or certain vegetation species to armor up with living armor certain areas, right? Have you ever been to a campsite that was covered in grass? That's why. Right? Grasses can handle a lot more trampling passes, up to 1,000 or so, maybe even per day. A high nutrient, high soil cycling regime. A forest floor patch covered with ferns, for example, so a non-woody forest, herbaceous forest floor cover species, it can't handle one pass, right? So you can make decisions on where am I going to aim my recreationist trampling pressure. Let me put it on the grass. Let me put it on basal rosette growing species or whatever. And again, our vegetation is going to give us a lot of soundscape positive effects as well as air filtration effects. People who live downwind of a forest are breathing much, much cleaner air than somebody living upwind of a forest. And that is measurable on a population level. And trees are also, leafy trees are going to also absorb a whole lot of noise, and noise kills a lot of people. We'll talk about that in the soundscapes. Veg anchor soil beyond where trees can, so up in the alpine transition zone, this is all we have to work with, so we have to be very careful with it. We saw those pictures of Yosemite's Tuolumne Meadow where people were walking multiple parallel trails in and killing off the wildflowers up there, right? This is the kind of environment where this is all we have left to work with, so to speak, as we're going up the mountain in terms of soil protection and water protection, because soils harm water in the wrong place. We're going to call fungi vegetation. I know that mycologists are going to be just rolling over in their graves on that, but we got places to go, people to see, and meadows to trample. I'm kidding. And of course, your wildlife species are inextricably dependent on your local vegetation composition, structure, and function. All right? So for all of these reasons, this is just a long catalog or list of values that we attach to vegetation resources, both as recreation managers and as recreationists. And even dead vegetation in specific forms and growth classes and so forth. Snags, large standing dead trees, critical habitat for any of your larger wildlife, okay? Bears, mountain lions, etc. We have a small cartoon for a moment of levity. Hey there, mind if I have some sweet nectar? Sure, come on in. I love what you've done the place and you smell great. Hey, what's on my back? Nothing, just keep reaching for that sugar. This is a pollination joke, and I apologize if this is weird or awkward. Moving on. This is a video I took at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And this is just to remind us what forest stands full of mature trees and snags looks like. So we don't, here in the Midwest, have a lot of real high quality, high density, snag oriented habitat, right? The entire Midwest has been cut over many, many times, and the snags that we do have are relatively recent. The 2009 derecho did give us a whole bunch of snag by topping a bunch of trees and killing them off. Those that it didn't just pick up and uproot and throw like matchwood. But where those snags are freshly created, right, that's going to be functionally a release cut ecologically, and we're going to release sunlight and water to get down to the forest understory layer, and we'll get sort of another go around on the cycle of succession. Pretty cool stuff. All right. So that means your timber stand improvement plans for your national park are generally going to be aimed towards moving things towards mature, less disturbed, less scrubby ecosystems, okay? And stand compositions and age structures.